In a village, one knows everybody, and knowing everybody means knowing everything, including what they are capable of, long before they themselves suspect it. Miss Jane Marple, Chapter 1. The invitation that smelled of lavender and unease. The 22nd of December arrived in St. Mary Mead wrapped in a crisp white silence, the kind that settles over an English village when snow has not quite fallen, but is most certainly thinking about it. The elms along Church Lane stood rigid as sentries. The postman's bicycle wheels crunched over the frozen gravel with a sound like broken biscuits. Smoke rose in perfectly straight gray columns from the cottage chimneys along the high street, undisturbed by even the suggestion of a breeze. A tabby cat sat on the wall outside the butcher's shop with an expression of profound philosophical detachment, utterly unbothered by the cold in the way that only cats and very old vicars ever truly manage. And in the front sitting-room of Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple was engaged in the profoundly satisfying task of untangling a particularly obstinate knot in a skein of pale blue wool when the letter arrived. She had been at it for nearly 20 minutes, her slender fingers working with the patient, methodical persistence that distinguished her approach to knots and to people and to crimes, which were, in her considerable experience, all essentially the same sort of problem requiring the same quality of attention. Outside, the village was conducting itself with the subdued, festive energy of a community that has ordered its Christmas goose, attended its carol rehearsal, and is now in the contemplative phase of waiting for the 25th to arrive and justify all the preparation. The baker had strung a paper chain in his window. Mrs. at Price Ridley had placed tall candles on her sill in a manner she clearly considered restrained and tasteful, and the rest of the village privately considered rather competitive. Life, in short, was proceeding along entirely predictable lines. It was precisely the sort of morning on which something unpredictable tends to arrive. It came in a cream envelope of considerable quality. The sort of envelope, Miss Marple noted, that one does not find at the village stationer's, but orders specifically from a shop on Bond Street or thereabouts. The handwriting was small, precise, and slanted somewhat aggressively to the right, as though the writer were perpetually leaning forward into a strong wind. The scent, unmistakably, was lavender, the old-fashioned kind, dried and pressed rather than purchased from a bottle. But beneath it, if one's nose were particularly attentive, there was something else, something faintly clinical, almost pharmaceutical, the kind of smell one associates with a well-stocked dispensary or the back room of a chemist's shop that deals in considerably more than aspirin. Miss Marple set down her wool and opened the letter with a silver-handled letter knife that had belonged to her Aunt Agnes, and had opened a great many letters in its time, some of them considerably more alarming than this one. Dear Miss Marple, it would give me the very greatest pleasure if you would consent to join our Christmas dinner at Rectory Lane Manor on the evening of Christmas Eve. The occasion is one of some significance to our family, as you will understand when I tell you that I intend it to be an evening of true reconciliation, the gathering of those who have drifted apart, brought back together as they ought to have been years ago. I write to you particularly because of your long friendship with the late Reverend Croft, whose memory I hold most dear, and whose daughter, myself, invites you now in his honor. Dinner at 7 o'clock. The motor can be sent for you at 6:30. Yours sincerely, Lady Euphemia Croft, née Alderton, Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she held it up to the pale winter light from the window and read it a third time, paying particular attention to the phrase, "an evening of some significance," and to the peculiar formality of a woman who signed her maiden name in brackets, as though reminding herself, or perhaps the recipient, of who she truly was beneath the title she had acquired at 31. Lady Euphemia Croft had been Miss Euphemia Alderton for the first 31 years of her life, youngest daughter of the old vicar of St. Mary Mead, a mild and bookish clergyman who had worn the same 3 suits in rotation for 40 years, and never raised his voice above the level required to conduct a Sunday sermon in a modestly sized church. Miss Marple had known Euphemia as a girl, a bright, somewhat imperious child who always stood too close when she spoke to you, as though proximity were a form of argument, as though being nearer a person gave one a natural advantage over them. She had married Sir Reginald Croft at 31, moved to Rectory Lane Manor at the end of the village, and had been, by all accounts, a formidably organized presence in that household ever since. Sir Reginald had died 14 months ago. There had been whispers, as there always were in St. Mary Mead when a titled man died, leaving a large house and an unread will, and a family whose various members had, over the years, demonstrated varying degrees of genuine affection for one another. Miss Marple had attended the funeral, offered her condolences, and paid the whispers only the polite professional attention they deserved at the time. But now this letter, this lavender letter with its undertone of something clinical, its careful phrasing, its curious and deliberate timing. "Reconciliation," Miss Marple murmured aloud to her sitting-room, and the word hung in the air between the fireplace and the wool-basket, round and ripe and slightly ominous. In Miss Marple's long experience, reconciliation was almost never what it presented itself as being. It was, more often than not, a word people used when they meant confrontation, or reckoning, or the careful management of consequences that had been allowed to accumulate for too long. She wrote her acceptance that same afternoon in a neat, unhurried hand, and posted it at 4 o'clock. On Christmas Eve, at precisely 23 minutes past 6, she stood at her garden gate in her good wool coat and second-best gloves, a small brown portmanteau at her feet. She was looking, with unhurried attention, at the lights burning in the windows of Rectory Lane Manor at the far end of the lane, 7 windows illuminated simultaneously, in a house whose mistress was reportedly in reduced health and employed a reduced staff. 7 rooms in simultaneous use was rather more than one might expect for an intimate family gathering. Either Lady Euphemia was a woman who wasted electricity on principle, or the gathering was somewhat larger than the word family had suggested. Neither explanation in itself was alarming, but either, in combination with the pharmaceutical smell on a lavender letter, was worth setting carefully aside to consider later. The motor arrived. The driver, a young man she did not recognize, which was in itself notable in a village where she recognized everyone, tipped his cap without quite meeting her eyes. Miss Marple noted this, as she noted everything. The evening, she felt with the particular quiet certainty that had never once failed her in 70-some years of attentive living, was going to be rather more interesting than Christmas dinner usually was. Chapter 2. The guests assemble, and not one of them is quite at ease. Rectory Lane Manor in winter had a quality of theatrical grandeur that its residents appeared to have absorbed so completely as to have become entirely immune to it. The hall was paneled in dark oak, the kind that drinks candlelight and gives back only shadows. the kind that makes a perfectly ordinary room feel like the anteroom to something significant. Holly had been arranged along the mantelpiece with aggressive festivity, too much of it, too precisely symmetric, as though someone had decorated not from any natural impulse of seasonal warmth, but from a sense of obligation, a duty performed rather than a pleasure taken. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the drawing-room, hung with glass baubles of deep red and gold, perfectly dressed, and undeniably beautiful, and somehow entirely cheerless, in the way that beautiful things are cheerless when no one in the room is genuinely happy. Miss Marple was received by Constance Fry, the housekeeper, who had the look of a woman carrying a considerable internal weight, with the practiced, professional grace of long domestic service. She was perhaps 60, solidly built, with gray hair pinned so severely above her ears that it appeared more structural than cosmetic. She had been with the Croft household for 30 years, longer, therefore, than the manor had been a Croft household at all, having come with the furniture and the kitchen receipts from the preceding establishment. She helped Miss Marple with her coat, folded it over her arm with quiet efficiency, and said, "Her ladyship is in the drawing-room, Miss Marple. The others are already arrived," with a slightly weighted emphasis on others that, in the vocabulary of a careful housekeeper, suggests the word deserves quotation marks and, possibly, a brief advisory note attached. Miss Marple entered the drawing-room and took stock. Lady Euphemia Croft stood nearest the fireplace, upright and formidable in a gown of deep burgundy that had been expertly made and was at least 3 years old, which said either that she was economical or that she no longer cared to impress. And Miss Marple suspected it was the former. She was 70 now, and age had not softened her so much as concentrated her. The imperious quality of her girlhood had been refined by 7 decades of practice into something much closer to iron. Her eyes moved quickly and constantly across the room, the eyes of a woman who has spent a lifetime monitoring multiple things simultaneously. Her right hand rested lightly and consistently against her lower ribs, so lightly as to appear natural, so consistently maintained as to be unmistakably habitual. A woman conscious of a pain she has chosen not to discuss. Her son, Gerald Croft, stood by the drinks cabinet with a glass of whiskey that Miss Marple assessed, from its depth and his particular quality of stillness, was not his first. Gerald was 44, and had been, in his youth, quite strikingly handsome. The dark Croft coloring, the strong jaw, the easy confidence of a man accustomed to rooms turning slightly toward him. Time had complicated rather than undone these qualities. He was still handsome in the way a good house whose maintenance has been somewhat neglected is still a good house, the original quality visible beneath more recent inattentions. His evening coat was well tailored, but had been brushed with the slightly excessive care of a man for whom presentation has become compensatory. Beside him, though not quite with him, for there existed between them a precise, carefully maintained distance that communicated something in itself, stood his wife, Vivian Croft. She was 40, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of watchful stillness that is either very great intelligence or very great patience, and is most often, in Miss Marple's experience, both simultaneously. She wore on her left wrist only a thin gold watch, and on her right hand nothing at all. She was reading the room as Miss Marple was reading it, and when she caught Miss Marple's eye across the assembled company, she produced a smile, quick, pleasant, practiced, and looked away first. Near the window, separated from the family group by the careful geography of guests who understand their position exactly, stood Dr. Noel Ashby, the Croft family physician. He was perhaps 55, thin-shouldered, with the permanent slight frown that physicians acquire when they have spent too many years in possession of things about their patients that the patients would strongly prefer they did not know. He was speaking to no one, and nursing a glass of pale sherry with the focused inward attention of a man whose mind is entirely elsewhere, and is finding elsewhere significantly more troubling than here. Oliver Mace, the London solicitor, occupied the armchair nearest the fire, with the easy self-possession of a man accustomed to rooms in which everyone else is anxious. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, pleasant-faced, and revealed nothing. He carried a leather briefcase, placed not at his feet, where briefcases conventionally reside, but on his lap, the placement of a man who does not permit consequential things to drift beyond his direct physical control. In the corner nearest the French windows, half in shadow, sat Sylvie Beaumont, Lady Euphemia's companion, French, perhaps 28, with dark, expressive eyes and a composed, watchful expression that Miss Marple had seen before on the faces of young women who have learned, at a relatively early age, that careful observation is a significantly safer occupation than active participation. Colonel Harwick arrived 7 minutes after Miss Marple, loud and red-faced, and filling the doorway rather completely, radiating the cheerful, physical confidence of a man for whom the world has generally arranged itself accommodatingly. He had apparently encountered their motor on the road, and had been, as he announced with enormous satisfaction, press-ganged into the festivities by dear Euphemia's impeccable hospitality. He shook several hands, admired the tree extravagantly, declared the house entirely unchanged since 1922, and accepted a large brandy with the grateful enthusiasm of a large man who has been cold and is now warm. Lady Euphemia welcomed him with genuine warmth around a fractional nucleus of surprise. He was not planned for. The dinner gong sounded at precisely 7 o'clock. Miss Marple went in to dine with her evening bag on her arm, and her most tranquil expression arranged upon her face, thinking about which of the 7 people assembled in that drawing-room was frightened, which was dangerous, and the most interesting question, whether those 2 qualities were, as they so often turned out to be, concentrated in the same individual. Chapter 3. The Dinner Table, and what the seating arrangement revealed. The dining room at Rectory Lane Manor was the kind of room that reminds one, inescapably, of a formal portrait, long and proportioned with the confident architecture of a century ago, when houses were built to communicate permanence rather than comfort. A white marble fireplace at one end, French windows at the other, frosted tonight with ice and filled with December darkness. The table was laid with silver and white linen, and low red winter roses that had cost rather more than Miss Marple suspected Lady Euphemia's current circumstances comfortably allowed. Seating arrangements, Miss Marple had always maintained, are the autobiography of a dinner party. They reveal whom the host fears, whom she wishes to manage, whom she trusts, and, occasionally, whom she cannot permit to sit adjacent to someone else without consequence. Lady Euphemia sat at the head, Oliver Mace to her right, a placement that could not have been accidental, positioning the solicitor within easy private communication. Colonel Harwick to her left, the unplanned element managed with hospitable practicality. Gerald Croft midway down the right side, Vivian precisely opposite him, across the table rather than beside him, which might be coincidental and almost certainly was not. Dr. Ashby near the foot, slightly apart, with Sylvie Beaumont to his side. Miss Marple at the far end, the position of an honored guest in designation, though not in practice. From the far end she could see every face. The consommé was clear and excellent. During it, Colonel Harwick told a lengthy story about a shooting party, whose conclusion involved a retriever and a significant portion of the day's bag. Gerald refilled his wine glass twice in close succession and laughed at the Colonel's story a precise half-beat late, the laugh of a man whose attention is engaged elsewhere. Vivian ate with neat efficiency and watched her husband over the rim of her glass with the sustained attention of a woman who has been watching a particular situation for some time and has not yet decided what to do about it. The fish course brought a shift. Lady Euphemia leaned slightly toward Oliver Mace and said something in a low voice. Low, but given the room's acoustics and the quality of Miss Marple's hearing, not inaudible at the far end of the table. The phrase, "after dinner, as agreed," reached her with crystalline clarity. Oliver Mace nodded and shifted his briefcase closer to his foot. A will, or something of equivalent consequence, the kind of document that changes the arrangement of a family's future. Gerald had heard it too. Miss Marple observed his gaze travel from his mother's profile to the solicitor's briefcase and back in the span of approximately 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, his expression underwent a series of rapid, carefully suppressed changes that told her a very great deal indeed. The roast goose was consumed in the appreciative, largely wordless silence that properly good food deserves. Conversation became general and pleasant. The roads, the prospect of snow, the carol service that afternoon. Dr. Ashby contributed minimally, and twice began sentences that he did not complete, steering himself each time back toward safer conversational ground, with the slightly abrupt redirection of a man navigating away from something he is not ready to approach. And then the table was cleared, the candles burned lower and warmer, and Constance Fry appeared in the doorway bearing the Christmas pudding. It was magnificent, dark, dense, and perfectly domed upon its blue china plate garlanded with holly. As Constance set it at the table's center and Gerald Croft produced his lighter with prompt, too easy helpfulness, the pudding bloomed into blue flame, and every person at the table drew a single collective breath of entirely genuine pleasure. For that one moment, unified by the oldest and simplest of seasonal rituals, no one in the room was afraid of anything. Then Constance began to serve, and the moment dissolved. She moved in the orderly circuit of an experienced servant, beginning at the head of the table, working systematically downward. The first portion, cut from the very crown of the pudding, was placed directly before Lady Euphemia's seat, as tradition and positioning required. It was visibly distinct, larger, more richly formed. The top slice with the characteristic dense center that experienced pudding lovers always prefer. It was at this precise moment that Colonel Harwick, with the natural, a cheerful disregard for ceremony of a large man who has always been well received at table and has never seen any reason to alter this, leaned across and helped himself to Lady Euphemia's plate with the broad announcement, "Capital. Never could resist the first slice. My late wife always despaired of me at pudding time. Never did improve." Lady Euphemia blinked, started to speak, then composed herself into gracious resignation, and accepted the portion that had been intended for Gerald. She said something pleasant. She smiled. Miss Marple observed all of this from the far end of the table. She ate her own modest portion and thought about prussic acid and about the smell of bitter almonds and about a woman she had known in Basingstoke 30 years ago who had made the irreversible error of sitting in the chair intended for someone else. 40 minutes later, Colonel Harwick complained of a violent headache behind the eyes. An hour after that, settled in the wing chair of the drawing-room, with everyone's concerned attention upon him, he was dead. Chapter 4. The constable draws the wrong conclusion, and Miss Marple begins to draw the right one. Constable Peel arrived at 9:10, telephoned by Dr. Ashby, who had communicated the facts of the situation in the careful, minimal manner of a man uncertain how much he ought to say before speaking with greater authority. The constable was 26, possessed of genuine, conscientious concern and limited experience in approximately equal measure, a combination that makes an officer earnest and thorough and wrong in fairly predictable ways. Dr. Ashby stood near the colonel with the posture of a physician who has done what could be done and found it insufficient. The family arranged themselves in the drawing-room in positions that appeared natural and were clearly not. Gerald on the sofa, hands clasped with a stillness that was not grief. Vivian by the window, looking at no one. Lady Euphemia upright by the fireplace, Oliver Mace beside her, his hand resting on his briefcase. Sylvie near the door, as though uncertain whether her presence was required or intrusive. The constable produced his notebook and asked questions, good questions, if not quite in the right order, directed toward the most accessible rather than the most relevant witnesses. He was particularly attentive to Dr. Ashby's medical assessment. Natural causes, he offered, hopefully. Consistent with cardiac failure, Dr. Ashby said carefully, constructing the phrase with the precision of a man who understands the difference between consistency and certainty, and wishes that distinction to exist on record, however indirectly. A large man, rich dinner, considerable wine, the excitement of the evening. Gerald Croft added smoothly from the sofa, "These things happen." He spread his hands in a small, regretful gesture. Miss Marple sat in her corner saying nothing and conducting a precise internal inventory. Dr. Ashby was declining to name the cause directly in the family's presence, meaning he suspected something inconsistent with natural death. The colonel had died from a portion removed from Lady Euphemia's place, the first cut, the most distinct, the one a person wishing to target the hostess would logically choose. Lady Euphemia's expression contained, beneath grief and shock, something Miss Marple identified after consideration as recognition, the expression of a person connecting, with reluctant and terrible clarity, facts she has been keeping separate. Gerald Croft had not wept. Vivian had, twice, briefly. Oliver Mace's briefcase, which had been at his chair throughout dinner, had been quietly relocated to the hall during the evening's confusion. Dr. Ashby had looked at the remains of the pudding on the sideboard, with the expression of a man in the presence of something he knows, and deeply wishes he did not. The constable concluded his initial inquiry at 10:45. He was courteous, systematic, and departed, in the comfortable belief that Colonel Harwick had died of his own generous constitution and the season's excess. He promised to return in the morning, and suggested it was probably nothing to be concerned about. Miss Marple asked Lady Euphemia if she might stay the night. Lady Euphemia agreed at once, with the grateful urgency of a woman who has been surrounded by people for hours and has felt entirely alone throughout. The blue bedroom was cold and furnished with the solid, slightly faded comfort of a room that has served as guest accommodation for many years. Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by the window looking out at the frozen kitchen garden, pale and still under the clouded sky, and she thought with the focused, unhurried clarity that the dark hours uniquely permit. Prussic acid, cyanide compound, introduced into rich food. Symptoms indistinguishable in a person known to have cardiac weakness from natural cardiac failure. In a healthy man of the Colonel's considerable size, the effect was less clean, more sudden, more obvious, more consequential in precisely the wrong direction for the person who had planned it. Someone had designed this with real care. Someone had made a careful calculation and had it undone by the simplest possible variable, the innocent, magnificent appetite of a man who never could resist the first slice of anything. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Miss Marple had a complete theory fitting every known fact with the neatness of good workmanship. She required one further confirmation, a single additional piece of evidence to convert theory into certainty. She was quite sure she knew where to find it. Chapter 5, in which the kitchen reveals its secrets and the housekeeper. Her conscience. Miss Marple descended the stairs at 6:30 on Christmas morning before the household stirred. The house had the suspended, held-breath quality of a place where something terrible has happened and has not yet been fully processed, as though grief and guilt and ordinary life had all been paused overnight, waiting for the day to give them permission to resume. The sound of careful, methodical activity came from the kitchen. The early, reliable sounds of someone who has risen before dawn every morning for 30 years and does not require daylight to move efficiently through her domain. Constance Fry stood at the great kitchen range with her back to the door, warming milk with the methodical precision of someone whose hands know their work too well to require direct supervision. She turned when Miss Marple entered, and Miss Marple saw, in the thin gray light from the kitchen window, that the housekeeper had not slept. Her eyes were dry. Constance was not a woman who wept when troubled. She was a woman who went very still and very focused. But they carried the particular quality of someone who has spent a long night alone, in the company of something they cannot put down or walk away from. "I hope you'll forgive the early intrusion," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I have always been an early riser. Would it be any great trouble for a small cup of tea?" Constance's expression moved through several rapid adjustments before settling into the professional composure of a good housekeeper, receiving a reasonable domestic request at an unreasonable hour. "Of course, Miss Marple. Please sit down." Miss Marple sat at the long pine kitchen table and looked about with the pleasant, unhurried interest of a woman with a great deal of morning time on her hands. The kitchen was very clean, unusually so, even accounting for the standards a housekeeper of Constance's quality maintains. A great dinner leaves particular traces, flour in corners, the ghost smell of warm sugar, the rings left by pudding molds on preparation surfaces. This kitchen had been cleaned with particular attention to the area around the range and the preparation surface immediately to its left. A thorough cleaning, performed by a woman who was simultaneously doing it and thinking about something else with great intensity. "The pudding was your own receipt?" Miss Marple asked, accepting her tea. A pause, fractional, controlled, but present. "It has been her ladyship's family receipt for 30 years, Constance said. "I have made it each Christmas since I came to the manor." It was genuinely excellent, Miss Marple said sincerely. The brandy, particularly. The quality of brandy in a Christmas pudding reveals the cook's character, I have always thought. Constance set down her own cup and looked at Miss Marple. A long, measuring look, the look of a woman who is exhausted and afraid, and whose conscience has been awake since before midnight. Miss Marple, she said quietly, I think you may know something. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that you know something too, and I think it has been sitting with you all night. The kitchen held its stillness. Outside the window, the frozen garden lay undisturbed and pale, and a single robin on the fence post was singing with the entirely unreasonable optimism of small birds on cold mornings. Then Constance Fry sat down, folded her hands on the table, and spoke, steadily, without dramatics, in the manner of a woman giving testimony rather than confession. For she had nothing to confess but much to report. The pudding had been prepared 2 days before Christmas, as was her custom. On the morning of Christmas Eve she had inspected it at 10 o'clock and found it, as she had left it. She had added the brandy mixture herself at noon, covered it again, and gone about her afternoon work. At approximately 20 minutes to 3, she had received a telephone call on the kitchen telephone. Unusual, since household calls came in on the main instrument in the hall. The caller was a woman who spoke in a confused manner and appeared to believe she had reached an entirely different household, asking repeatedly for someone called Mrs. Pemberton. Constance had spent over 20 minutes being apologized to before the caller rang off. When she returned to the kitchen, the pudding appeared undisturbed. But there had been a smell. Very faint, Constance said. When I lifted the covering cloth to check, I noticed it and told myself it was the brandy, or something from the range. I told myself it was nothing. She paused. I have worked in this house for 30 years. I know every person in it. And you knew what the smell was, Miss Marple said. Constance's hands tightened slightly on each other. Almonds, she said. Bitter almonds. I smelled it once before, long ago, in another household. I knew what it was then. I knew it last evening, too, and chose not to know it. Prussic acid, the cyanide compound, carries in its concentrated form the characteristic scent of bitter almonds. Introduced into a brandy mixture, stirred well and covered, it would leave only the faintest trace by evening, sufficient to kill a person of slight build with a weakened heart, sufficient, in the Colonel's case, to produce significantly more conspicuous results. The kitchen telephone number, Miss Marple said. Is it listed in the household directory in the hall? In the blue book on the hall table, Constance confirmed. It has been there since the telephone was installed. And the passage door at the far end of the kitchen, the one that connects to the main staircase hall, when you returned from the telephone, was it exactly as you had left it? Constance was still for a moment. Then, open by perhaps an inch, she said slowly, I noticed it and closed it and thought nothing of it. That door connected the kitchen directly to the staircase, serving all principal bedrooms. A person resident in the house could have descended, crossed to the kitchen, interfered with the pudding, returned upstairs, and been at their dressing table again in less time than a confused call about Mrs. Pemberton required. You have done nothing wrong, Miss Marple said with quiet firmness. Please go about your Christmas morning duties exactly as you ordinarily would. Speak to no one about this, and whatever remains of the pudding, please ensure it is not touched or disturbed by anyone at all. Constance Fry rose, nodded once with the grave and visible relief of a woman who has finally been permitted to set something very heavy down, and returned to her work. Miss Marple went back upstairs through the quiet house, thinking about manufactured telephone calls and passage doors, and the kind of meticulous planning that attends a crime designed to be invisible, and how such crimes are always, in the end, undone not by dramatic revelation, but by the accumulation of small, patient observations. Chapter 6. Miss Marple conducts 3 conversations, each of which reveals something. By 9 o'clock, the household had assembled for a subdued Christmas morning. Breakfast was laid in the dining room, kedgeree, toast, coffee, cold meats, and the family and guests moved through it with the careful social courtesy of people maintaining the forms of civilization, under circumstances that have rendered those forms faintly absurd. Christmas morning. A dead man in the night. Holly on the mantelpiece. Toast in the rack. Miss Marple ate a modest breakfast, observed everyone, and at 9:30 requested a private word with Oliver Mace in the library. Oliver Mace was a man of considerable professional experience, which included extensive experience of being managed by people who imagined they were doing so without his awareness. He received Miss Marple's request with the alert, measured attention of a man who recognizes genuine intelligence in unexpected packaging, and has the wisdom not to underestimate it. "I want to ask about the will," Miss Marple said, once the library door was closed. "Client privilege, Miss Marple," he said pleasantly. "Your client is Lady Euphemia," Miss Marple said with equal pleasantness. "Lady Euphemia's life was in direct and serious danger last night, and I believe it may remain so while the situation is unresolved. I wonder whether, in that context, privilege might yield a fraction to practical necessity." Mace regarded her for a careful moment. Then he said, "What do you need to know?" "2 things only. Was the will substantially changed recently? And does Gerald Croft know its terms?" Oliver Mace was quiet for a measured interval. The will was redrawn in October and signed on the 19th. Gerald was informed in November that a new document existed. He has not been told what it contains. He paused. He would have been informed last night, following dinner, had the evening proceeded as planned. And the contents represent a very significant departure from his expectations, Miss Marple said. Oliver Mace said nothing. His silence, in its completeness and its timing, was the most informative response available to him. Her second conversation was with Sylvie Beaumont, found in the morning room writing rapidly in a letter she placed face down when Miss Marple entered. Before Sylvie's hand covered it, Miss Marple noted the French salutation, a man's name at the top of the page, and the closely written density of someone with a great deal to communicate, and the urgency that comes from delayed communication. "I have been admiring your composure this morning," Miss Marple said, settling herself comfortably. "It is not a natural thing, what happened last evening." "It was dreadful," Sylvie said quietly. "The Colonel was a kind man. He made everyone laugh. You were in the kitchen for some time after the Colonel was taken ill," Miss Marple observed mildly. "I went for brandy. And the kitchen maid was very distressed. I stayed a few minutes." "The brandy cupboard is in the passage," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "A journey of perhaps 3 minutes. You were absent for 12. Sylvie Beaumont looked at her with the direct, level gaze of a young woman who has decided that honesty is significantly simpler than performance. "I was reading a letter," she said. "I had collected it from the hall table when we arrived, and had not found a private moment before dinner. It was personal, a matter of some feeling. It has nothing to do with last evening. From France, Miss Marple asked. A slight increase of stillness. From a friend in Paris, a private matter. She paused. I can see it looks suspicious. It looks entirely human, Miss Marple said warmly, and I believe you entirely. You have been most helpful. Her third conversation, and the most important, was with Vivian Croft. She found her in the rose garden at 10:30, walking in her fur coat along the frozen paths with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who is walking because she requires movement rather than destination. She was not walking for pleasure. She was walking because motion is sometimes the only available substitute for action when action is not yet possible. Mrs. Croft, Miss Marple said, falling into step beside her. I hope you will permit me to be direct. I believe you know what I have spent this morning determining, and I believe the weight of knowing it alone has been very considerable. Vivian walked in silence for several steps. The frozen rose beds stood on either side of the path, stripped of everything except thorns and architecture, beautiful in the austere way that things from which everything inessential has been removed are beautiful. The frost caught the thin morning light in each stem and held it briefly. You've worked it out, Vivian said, not a question. I have formed a clear picture, Miss Marple said. I have not yet shared it with the constable. A longer silence. Then Vivian spoke in a quiet, steady voice, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something alone for too long, and has at last found someone adequate to share the weight of it. Gerald had received a letter in November from a creditor in London, one of several, but this one with a particular deadline and a sum that made the others look manageable. He had for years been depending on his inheritance to resolve what had accumulated. When the solicitor's letter arrived informing him that a new will existed, Gerald had become very quiet, very focused, very unlike his ordinary careless self. In early December she had found in his study a letter, written in his hand, addressed to a man in London, in an area of the city that housed, as among other establishments, certain specialist supply trades. The letter was carefully worded, its intent not explicitly stated, but she had read enough before replacing it. I told myself I had misread it, she said. I am very practiced at telling myself things. The cufflink, Miss Marple said quietly. Vivienne stopped walking. The frost crunched under her heel. She turned and looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was nothing any more, except bare and exhausted truth. I noticed it at the dinner table, Miss Marple said. The left cufflink, a faint, pale residue along the edge, the kind left by handling a dry powdered compound, the kind of compound that carries the smell of almonds. Vivian Croft stood in the frozen rose garden in silence for a very long time. A black bird crossed the gray sky overhead. The light was thin and cold and entirely clear. What happens now? She said at last. The constable must be told everything, Miss Marple said gently, with the quiet inevitability of someone stating what both of them already know. I am sorry. I know, Vivian said. I have known it since the colonel's face changed at the table, and I understood immediately what had happened. Not what had been intended, what had gone wrong. She paused. He did not intend it to be the colonel. No, Miss Marple said. He did not. Chapter 7. Gerald Croft gives his version, and Miss Marple gives hers. Constable Peel returned at 11 o'clock. I telephoned by Miss Marple at 10:30, arriving in a state of nervous but purposeful energy. He brought Sergeant Perkins from the town, a solid, gray-eyed man who listened more than he spoke and wrote things down with the precise economy of someone who has learned that the most significant evidence is very often delivered in the quietest voice. Gerald Croft was invited to the library and accepted the invitation with a calm that was too studied to be entirely natural. He sat and explained himself. He had been at home throughout Christmas Eve. He had been as shocked and grieved as anyone by the colonel's death. He had no knowledge of any substance of any description. He said all of this smoothly, fluently, without hesitation. The speech of a man who has been rehearsing it, Miss Marple judged, for approximately 6 weeks. Sergeant Perkins let him finish. Then, in the mild tone of a man inquiring about the weather, he asked about Gerald's outstanding financial obligations, about the new will and what Gerald understood of its contents, about his movements between 2:30 and 3:30 on Christmas Eve afternoon. Gerald said he had rested in his bedroom after luncheon. He said this without hesitation, which was itself a particular kind of information. "You were observed," Miss Marple said from near the window, passing through the hall toward the kitchen passage at approximately 10 minutes to 3. Gerald looked at her. By whom? The question came quickly, too quickly. By Sylvie Beaumont, who was passing through the hall at that time. It was an inference stated as fact, with the quiet confidence of a woman who has done this before and knows its effect precisely. Gerald's composure showed its first genuine fracture. Something shifted behind his eyes, not dramatically, no great collapse, but the specific, unmistakable shift of a structure from which a load-bearing element has just been removed. He looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long time. Then he said, with the sudden, enormous relief of a man releasing something that has been crushing him from the inside, "I did not intend it to be the colonel." The sergeant's pen moved. Gerald spoke next in the quieter, factual voice of a man now simply delivering information rather than defending himself. The new will had existed. Oliver had told him so. He had not known its terms. He had assumed disinheritance, 30 years of assumption that the estate would be his, the debts in London that had grown beyond his management, the calculation that a death appearing natural in a woman with a documented cardiac condition would produce no investigation and leave the old will intact. "I chose a compound," he said, in the flat tone of a man reporting decisions he has already distanced himself from, that in a person with her medical history would appear entirely consistent with natural cardiac failure. Dr. Ashby had explained her condition to me some years ago. I understood what the symptoms would resemble. "Where did you obtain it?" Sergeant Perkins asked. Gerald gave the name and address of the London chemist without hesitation, with the visible relief of transferring information to someone else's keeping entirely. "The telephone call to the kitchen was arranged in advance," Miss Marple said, for the sergeant's record. "The kitchen telephone number is listed in the household directory in the hall. The call was designed to provide the access window required." Gerald descended via the staircase passage, introduced the prepared compound into the pudding's brandy covering, and returned upstairs. The total operation took no longer than the manufactured call required. "The colonel took the wrong slice," Gerald said. He said it without any expression at all. He was not expected to be present. I had made no accounting for him. He sat down without ceremony, Miss Marple said quietly, in the chair nearest to what he wanted. He did what he always did, and it killed him. Gerald said nothing further. The formal process of arrest proceeded from there with the quiet, procedural gravity that serious matters appropriately receive. Chapter 8. Christmas Afternoon, The Living, and the Truth Lady. Euphemia received the news in the drawing-room, seated very upright in her chair by the fire, with Oliver Mace to her right and Sylvie Beaumont on the ottoman at her feet. She listened to Sergeant Perkins with the absolute, concentrated stillness of a woman who is receiving every word and refusing to allow any of them to surface on her face before she has examined each one carefully. When he finished, she said, "I see." Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Sergeant," in the tone of someone thanking a person for information that has cost her considerably and that she intends to bear with appropriate dignity. When the sergeant had gone, the fire burned and the room held its silence. "I always knew the money mattered too much to him," Lady Euphemia said at last, to no one in particular. "His father was the same way. They accumulate the idea of money, what it represents, what it says about them, until the idea becomes larger than the thing itself, and larger than everything else around it." She pressed her hand briefly to her ribs in the old habitual gesture. "I thought the existence of the new will might redirect him, prompt him toward honesty, perhaps, or simply toward asking me directly what I intended. I should have spoken to him years ago, when it might have changed something. You could not have anticipated this," Oliver Mace said gently. "No," she agreed. "But I could have loved him better when he was young. That is the particular sadness of parents. We recognize our errors precisely at the moment they have become historical, and can no longer be corrected." Vivienne came downstairs at 3 o'clock. She had been upstairs since Gerald's arrest, and she came down dry-eyed and composed, and sat beside Lady Euphemia, and took the older woman's hand without saying anything at all. Lady Euphemia looked at their joined hands for a moment. Then she covered Vivien's hand with her own. Miss Marple, observing from across the room, thought this small exchange said considerably more about both women than anything spoken aloud that day. Dr. Ashby arrived at 2 o'clock. I gave Lady Euphemia a mild sedative, and sat with her for an hour, in the quiet, professionally attentive way of a doctor who understands that presence is sometimes more useful than medicine. When he left, he found Miss Marple in the hall, and stopped without preamble. "I suspected something," he said. "Gerald's manner at dinner. And there was a smell, near his coat in the cloakroom, when I retrieved my case before dinner. I noted it, and told myself I was being irrational." He paused. "Oh, I should have spoken." "You were afraid of being wrong," Miss Marple said. "Yes. It is the most human of fears," she said quietly, though not always the kindest response to it. Dr. Ashby put on his hat and coat and departed into the cold afternoon. Miss Marple stood alone in the hall for a moment. The Christmas tree burned quietly at the corridor's end with its red and gold. The holly along the staircase remained unchanged since her arrival, still too symmetric, still too deliberately arranged, but it seemed now to belong to a different story than the one it had been decorating when she first walked through this door. She thought about Colonel Harwick, who had been large and warm and indestructibly cheerful, and had died because he was all those things, because his appetite was generous and his manners were informal, and he sat down without ceremony in whatever chair was nearest, and took the first slice of whatever was presented without a thought for who it might have been set aside for. There were, she reflected, considerably worse qualities to have been defined by throughout one's life. considerably worse ways to have spent one's years. The light through the Manor's tall windows had turned gold and horizontal, the long, low light of a winter afternoon that makes everything appear briefly as though it belongs in a painting, as though the world has paused to compose itself for observation before resuming its ordinary motion. Oliver Mace found her standing there and said, "She will recover, do you think?" "She will," Miss Marple said. "Lady Euphemia is precisely the kind of woman who survives things. She has always known,